In 2021, a young researcher published his first scientific paper about rhinoceros beetles. His name was Ryo Shibata, and he was just 12 years old when his research appeared in Ecology, one of the world's leading scientific journals. He has spent over 4 years studying the Japanese rhinoceros beetle, and his findings went against what was considered a widely known fact about these insects, that they were strictly nocturnal. But not just that, his findings suggest that the labels we tend to give animals like nocturnal and diurnal may be far less rigid than we once thought. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering how on earth did a 12-year-old end up publishing a scientific paper in the first place? Well, let's take a moment to introduce how all of this even began. From a young age, Ryo has always been fascinated by the animals around him. He remembers spending countless afternoons exploring the woods and streams near his home with his father, where they would go around searching for tiny creatures. Then in kindergarten, Ryo caught his first Japanese rhinoceros beetle, and he immediately fell in love with these creatures. From then on, every summer, Ryo would find himself spending time at a nearby oak forest, observing how the beetles went about their day, and Ryo called it his little treasure chest. But one year, the entire forest was cut down, and soon all the beetles around his home disappeared. And for almost 2 years, he didn't see any beetles. However, during the summer of 2019, when he was in 4th grade, rhinoceros beetles suddenly began to appear on the Japanese ash tree in his backyard. That day, Ryo was the happiest he had been in a very long time, and he spent the day watching his new friends. But soon, he began to notice something very strange. These beetles were crawling across the tree and feeding on sap in broad daylight. Beetles that were supposed to be nocturnal. Over the next few days, Ryo searched through the encyclopedias he had at home and everything that he could find online. And sure enough, all the sources seemed to say that these beetles were strictly nocturnal. So Ryo did what any serious researcher would do. He began keeping a daily record of the beetles that visited the tree, noting down things like how many appeared, when they arrived, and even how long they would stick around. He also went to the library and borrowed every single book with beetle in its name and began scouring them for clues. That's when he came across a book called My Beetle Research by Professor Wataru Kojima, an insect ecologist at Yamaguchi University. Inside was a single, rather vague line. For reasons unknown, rhinoceros beetles sometimes visit ash trees during the day. This was the only source Ryo had found that referenced this behavior at all. This made him really excited, and he began writing an email to Professor Kojima to share his own observations and to try and ask some questions about what he had seen. The very next day, he received a reply. Kojima told him that this behavior had barely been studied scientifically, and no one really knew why rhinoceros beetles remained active on ash trees during the day. But he also told Ryo that the data he had been collecting was very valuable. He encouraged him to keep going and even gave him some advice on how to improve his observations. With Kojima's advice, Ryo continued his observations for the rest of summer. By the end of the break, he turned his notes and everything Kojima had taught him into a large research poster and submitted it to a school. The project went on to win a special prize at the local science fair and was later even recommended for a regional exhibition in Saitama. Soon after, Ryo wrote back to Kojima not only to thank him, but to send over the observations he had gathered throughout the summer. When Kojima saw this, he was extremely surprised at how detailed Ryo's observations actually were, as he had made sure to record the conditions of the beetles every single day for the entire summer. And when he realized how serious Ryo was, he encouraged him to continue if the beetles returned the following year. He even suggested some ways on how to make the research more precise, like marking individual beetles.
ただただ驚きました。やっぱり科学的に誰も今まで調べたことがなくて面白いんで継続して取り続けた方がいいんじゃないかと。
In the following year, the beetles showed up on Ryo's ash tree again. He spent the entire summer observing them, and by the end of the season, Ryo wrote to say his study was finished. This time, he sent back a comprehensive report documenting the behaviors of over 100 individual beetles. So next, let's take a look at what Ryo found. Ryo's research was focused on answering one simple question. Just how unusual was this behavior? To answer this, he would begin by individually marking each of the beetles that appeared on his ash tree with a unique pattern of paint so he could easily track them over time. During the day, Ryo checked on the beetles whenever he could and recorded what they were doing. At night, he asked his father for help, and the two of them would take turns staying awake to observe and photograph the beetles. On days when he had school, he asked his mother to film the tree, and he would check the recordings after school. And on days when the family went out, Ryo would ask his grandfather to help with observing the beetles while he was away. He would note down the behaviors of the beetles at different points in the day, and on some days he would do this as often as 13 times. This went on every single day for 35 days. Included in these observations was the date, time, the weather, which individual beetles were present, and what they were actually doing, like feeding, mating, or simply resting on the tree. By the end of the summer break, Ryo had recorded observations of 162 individual beetles.
終わった後見たらこんなにいたんだって、こんな多くのカブトムシに印をつけたんだってびっくりしました。もうなんか生活の中に研究が溶け込んでいる感じで、もうすごい毎回楽しみでしたね。
Now let's take a look at just how bizarre Ryo's findings are. Here are the typical activity levels of rhino beetles. You can see that they're fully nocturnal, where they arrive after sunset, peak around midnight, and leave by around 5 a.m. This is the pattern you'll find in textbooks and across most sources today. And now, here are the activity levels of the beetles in Ryo's backyard. You can see the pattern is completely different. While the beetles still mainly arrived at night, when the sun came up, most of them ended up staying. This completely goes against what is widely known as a strictly nocturnal species. But the most important part of Ryo's data came from tracking the beetles individually. Of the 162 beetles he marked, 76 were seen at least 3 times, and among these beetles, around 70% were seen on the tree during at least one daytime observation. In other words, many of them were the same individuals that had arrived at night, stayed after sunset, and continued to use the tree during the day. Some of them were even observed on the same tree for more than 24 hours, with the longest stay being 51 hours. And this is fascinating because rhino beetles are extremely at risk of visual predators in the day, with crows alone being responsible for up to 40% of predation events. This was the first time anyone had documented this behavior in such detail, and when Ryo sent these results to Professor Kojima, he was extremely impressed by how carefully the research had been carried out, and actually suggested Ryo to turn his research into a scientific paper. And so, in the spring of 2021, a rather unusual paper appeared in Ecology. The paper was authored by Professor Kojima, an ecologist at Yamaguchi University, and Ryo Shibata, a 12-year-old elementary school student. The paper detailed Ryo's observations of his beetles over the years and provided the clearest evidence yet that rhino beetles really were behaving very differently on ash trees. The study went on to receive widespread attention, and Ryo began appearing in newspapers and on television all across Japan. Now, at this point, most people would be pretty impressed. But we aren't done just yet, because just 2 years later, Ryo's name would appear again in another scientific paper in collaboration with Professor Kojima and 3 other scientists. This time, they wanted to investigate why exactly these beetles were behaving differently on ash trees. So next, let's take a look at this research. To understand why the beetles behave differently, Ryo and his colleagues tried to observe the behaviors of rhino beetles on 3 different species of trees that the beetles would usually visit. They noticed that on oak and crepe myrtle, the beetles were mainly active at night, while on ash trees, many of them remained active well into the day. More importantly, they noticed that one of the main reasons why beetles visited these trees in the first place is to feed on sap, and that gave them an idea. Could their weird behavior be somehow linked to their feeding habits on these trees? To test this, the researchers conducted experiments on beetles at 3 separate sites across Japan. The first was the ash trees in Sujido in Saitama, and these were done by Ryo himself. The second were the oak trees in Yamaguchi, and finally the crepe myrtle in Yakushima-cho. They first collected beetles from these sites and fasted them for 3 days to make sure that they were hungry. Then they weighed each of the beetles before releasing them into the trees. After letting them feed for an hour, the beetles were collected and weighed again. If there really was some difference in how much sap these trees provided, then it should be reflected in the weight of the beetles after their feeding session. And when they eventually looked at the results, that's exactly what they found, with the beetles that fed on the ash tree weighing much less after the feeding cycle. They later did a second experiment where they would make small cuts on each tree to measure the rate at which the sap left at different trees. And again, they found that both the oak and myrtle trees produced significantly more sap, with the oak tree having a much higher rate of sap flow and the myrtle tree producing sap for much longer periods with each opening, meaning the beetles could feed for longer with each excavation. This suggests that the beetles were not staying active because they had suddenly become daytime insects, but may simply have needed much longer to get enough food. And in a later study, Kojima found further evidence for this idea. He noticed that on oak trees, giant hornets sometimes arrive around dawn, and they drive rhinoceros beetles away from the sap. But when Kojima removed the hornets, he noticed those same beetles remained at the feeding sites until noon. And with this, Ryo and Kojima had shown that rhinoceros beetles may not be bound to a rigid nocturnal schedule after all, and that their activity can shift depending on something much more immediate, like how easily they can find food. This was a simple yet remarkable answer to a question that has puzzled insect lovers and scientists for decades. But when Ryo looked back on the summer that began all of this, what stayed with him was something much more personal.
コロナの影響でちょうどなんか旅行とか行けなかったし、ちょうど家にいたので、カブトムシが来てくれたので、とてもすごいラッキーで、カブトムシのおかげで楽しい夏休みになったなと思ってます。
Ryo's story began with something almost anyone could have seen. A group of beetles crawling across a tree in broad daylight. At first, it may be tempting to explain everything that followed through the people around Ryo. His father who stayed awake through the night, his mother who filmed while he was at school, his grandfather who watched when everyone else was away, and a scientist who treated the question of an elementary school student seriously. And while their support mattered enormously, none of this would have been possible without Ryo himself. Because where most people might have looked past without a second thought, Ryo stopped and asked why. Why were these beetles here in front of him when almost every textbook and source he could find described them as nocturnal? And perhaps that is what makes his work so remarkable. It was not only that he noticed something unusual, it was the courage to trust what he had seen and the patience to record his observations hour after hour, day after day, until the world around him started to pay attention. First Professor Kojima, then the judges at his science fair, and eventually inspiring researchers who worked alongside him to pursue the answer to a question that had remained unanswered for years. Ryo is now in high school, but every summer he still finds himself returning to the trees where rhinoceros beetles gather. He says there are still many mysteries hidden in their lives, and he hopes to keep observing them in the years ahead. And maybe it's really like Ryo says. During the summer of 2020, when much of the world was isolated, maybe his beetles really did come to visit him.